I first met Chyngyz Aitmatov 30 years ago and was immediately struck by what a nice man he was. Very modest, very cultured. And I also knew nothing about the Chyngyz. I had been to Kyrgyzia, up in the mountains, to the lake. And that was wonderful. We met, I think, in Peredelkina, just outside of Moscow. And before I met him, I thought, who is this man? Whom I'd never heard of. I began to read some of his work. And I realized that this man was one of the most outstanding writers of the 20th century. I'll repeat that. I came to the conclusion that this man was one of the greatest writers, greatest novelists, I should say, of the 20th century. I was amazed. I was amazed also because I found that his native language was not the language that I was reading. His native language was Kyrgyz. Very few writers, well-known writers in the world, had ever gone through that process of their native language, another language, and then translating that language himself. I know nobody who was able to do that. That was the first thing. The second thing that struck me about Aitmatov was that he wrote stories, short stories, in different genres. The most wonderful story, one of the most wonderful stories I've ever read in my life is Materинskoye Polye, which is in many ways typically Kyrgyz in that a mother is talking to the field, and it's mystical, and at the same time it's realistic. It's realistic because it talks about the terrible tragedy of the Second World War. Then we have the story that most Russians know, which is the first teacher, Первый учитель, and they know the film and so on and so forth, which also struck me as very interesting, because here is a man whose father was tortured and executed, and yet he's writing in a naive and innocent way about the early Soviet period, almost as if everything is forgotten. He forgives those who murdered his father. We knew nothing about that, of course, when I was living in the Soviet Union from 1960 to 1965. I didn't know that his father had been executed by the Soviet authorities at the time when there was the attack on nationalism, of course, and I found that terribly difficult to accept. I think I cried when I first read it. The other stories, totally different. How can an author write in so many different genres? Almost all the authors I know had written something that everyone would understand. But here was a writer doing something totally different, a phenomenon. And I wanted to read more. We agreed to meet in Moscow. And I can see it now. I can see a big bowl of caviar. And I was sitting there, and we had a good lunch, and very enjoyable. Most of my books up till then about 100 books I'd written were actually collections of folk tales, and therefore I felt together with him on that, and it was, so I enjoyed that enormously. I actually translated a number of his stories when I was living in Canada, and I had more time to do that. But the fairy tale, the folk tale element was very familiar to me. So it was something that I identified with, and that's very important as a translator, that you have to identify with your subject. Two of his short stories start with a picture, and he's describing a picture, which is also a great metaphor for life in general. So there are many, many reasons. Let me repeat, please, that I think this is one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. He must not be left to rot in his grave. He must be known throughout the world. Я его встретил несколько раз, и я очень горжусь этими встречами, потому что это мне показал Chyngyz Aitmatova, как он есть, не как писатель, а как человек. И он очень скромный человек был, очень скромный. Никто не думал бы, что это известный писатель. И последнее слово я хотел сказать. Я считаю, что Chyngyz Aitmatov один из самых выдающихся писателей в 20 веке. Безусловно. К сожалению, наверное, из-за того, что он киргиз, не русский, не англичанин, не немец, он не так известен, как он должен быть. И поэтому в ваших надежных руках я с удовольствием оставляю его работы. Спасибо, что вы это делаете.